Well, welcome back, everyone. It's just another day in the life as a military wife, and this week has caused me to reflect on a few things: how to bring civility back into civil discourse, how to agree to disagree or disagree appropriately. These are all things I've spoken about before, briefly on the podcast. And the 7 habits, which my mom taught us as kids, she would teach that, and she actually taught classes for it. Anyway, it all kind of boils into a hot take that I've got concerning how we act on social media and in our personal lives. So that's going to be a little bit about this week. As always, I am your host, Sam Wolf, and you're listening to Life of a Military Wife. Okay, so here's my hot take for the week, or just in general. I feel like social media is killing compassion and nuance. It has made it easier for people to say things that they would not previously had said to others because they're not saying it to their face. They're saying it behind a screen that they don't have to deal with the ramifications. And this all stems from a situation that occurred inside a community that my family is involved in. Other individuals in the community had a disagreement, and instead of letting letting those involved kind of work it out and come to a conclusion, they put it all over social media, and it caused a huge hullabaloo and a lot of hurt feelings, and it caused me to stop and think about how I represent myself on social media, how people act differently when they feel insulated from the consequences of their actions. And I've just always thought that I was raised with the 7 habits. My mom always taught us to seek to understand and then to be understood, and disagreeing appropriately and active listening and all of these techniques. And my degree has helped with those things. And I'm by no means perfect. There are definitely areas I can improve on, but these are just fundamental, foundational, just principles. This is just a concept that's kind of second nature. It's just my default in a lot of ways of how I think. And so when I run into these situations in my interpersonal relationships where stuff like this happens, I kind of get dumbfounded, and it feels really personal because I don't always remember that not everybody had the blessing of having those fundamental foundational principles taught to them at a young age. And even though I did, I'm not perfect at them. And it's important to show grace and compassion to those around us. Everyone has a bad day. Everyone says things that they wish they could take back. And we've all phrased something in an awkward way that we wish we could, reword. And so it's important to have those thoughts in mind when we interact with those around us. And again, I'm not perfect. I hope people will show me compassion for my bad days, and I hope that I can show compassion to others on their bad days. I feel like if we can do that, it will help make this world a slightly better place. But it got me thinking overall about the principles that my mother taught me, and how maybe there are people who would like to know or learn more. Maybe some of all y'all maybe you've heard about the 7 habits, but you don't know what it's about, or you've just never had the time to read it, or maybe you've not heard of the principles of disagreeing appropriately phrased that way. Maybe you have heard of these concepts, but you don't know much about them. So I want to talk about them today. And I was trying to record this while Baby Cuteness was taking her nap, but Baby Cuteness decided that Baby Cuteness needed to join me during our little talk. So I am wrestling a bubby while I talk to you this week. So basically, I was going back through the book, My mom gave me ages ago, 7 Habits for Highly Effective People by Stephen R. Covey. And it is a fabulous book. You can get it on audiobook. He wrote one for teenagers. He made books for kids. I have them all. I think I have them all. I know I have the ones for the kids. I read them to my kids. And the fifth habit that he talks about is seek first to understand, then to be understood. And I think a lot of times, and this is just my hot take, and you can disagree with that, in our interpersonal relationships, we do try to understand people more that we interact personally with or on a day-to-day basis. But when it comes to social media, we generally, people, will jump to conclusions that they may not if they were talking to that person in person. And sometimes we don't always listen as well when we are interacting online through written text as we do when we're in person. Also, there are lots of things to be said about listening skills in general. So in his book, Stephen R. Covey quotes some research, and I've heard this quoted multiple times before, and Bubby's trying to help me read the book, which is not helpful. But it says that communications experts estimate that only 10% of our communication is represented by the words we say. Another 30% is represented by our sounds, so the inflection, how we say it, and 60% by our body language. An empathetic listener can use their ears and their eyes and their heart. And that is really a huge component about seeking to understand, is being an empathetic listener. Other phrases that could describe an empathetic listener would be active listening, or what was the other word he used? Of course, now I can't find it. Okay. Attentive. Okay, I found it. I do take notes, but sometimes my handwriting is a little bit special. So, active, attentive, or empathetic listening are all basically the same concept. And I could spend an entire episode just talking about those. There are books about it. There's games to teach it. There's whole workshops and seminars. So I'm going to kind of brush over that. But basically, a lot of times when we're talking to people, we'll use negative listening habits such as selective listening, pretending, or even ignoring. And I feel like my children use these far more than I'd like. But okay, no, you cannot read the book to them, Bubby. I am trying to open up so I can get to my quote, and I have it all nice and marked. And Bubby is trying to help. So let's see if I can get to it before she can take the book from me. All right. So when I was talking about this before, I was mentioning the ignoring, pretending, and selective listening, which I said I think my children use all the time. And ignoring is when you're not really listening to the person at all. I think we all know what that means. Pretending is when you're like, oh yeah, right, like you're half listening or you're making audible responses, but you're not processing what's being said to you. And then selective listening is when you're only hearing enough so that you can like respond back. You're not fully committed to what you're hearing. Now, active listening or empathetic listening empathy is not sympathy to begin with. Sympathy is a form of agreement, a form of judgment. Empathy is more of trying to see it from their perspective. And for example, when you are listening, when you're I'm sure everyone has done this. I know I have done this. You're listening to someone talk and you're just listening long enough so that you can think of something to say in response. He calls it autobiographical listening. So we're evaluating, probing, advising, or interpreting. We're looking at it all of these analytical ways instead of actually just processing what's being said to us. And everybody goes through this in different ways. And I kind of want to break it down a little bit. So when I say evaluate, instead of active listening, what we're doing is listening to what they're saying to decide whether or not we agree or disagree with them. Probing is by asking questions from our own frame of reference instead of trying to see it from their frame of reference. Advising is when we're listening, but only just long enough so we can give them our opinion on how they should handle it. And then when we interpret, it's basically we're trying to figure out their motives and that sort of stuff, but we're using our own perspective. It's not with the empathy that I talked about before. So the difference between empathy and sympathy is supportive. It's like when you call your friend and you've had a bad day and you just want someone to be like, yeah, you're right. I got you. It's going to be fine. And you just kind of want that pep talk, which isn't bad, but that's more sympathy. An empathetic friend is going to listen and sometimes give you the hard facts, give you the things you don't want to hear. And I think that is really important in relationships is we're not always right, but an empathetic friend is going to stop, genuinely try to understand where you're coming from. If they don't understand, they're going to rephrase or ask you to rephrase, see if they understand correctly. That's the whole active listening thing. And get to the point where they understand, and then they'll be like, okay. And maybe they'll make a suggestion, or maybe they won't. Maybe they'll give words of encouragement, but they're stopping to really see it from your perspective instead of just throwing in their little commiseration. And it's not, again, all of the things I've said before are not terrible ways to respond, and we all do them on occasion. But especially when you're dealing with a situation in which there is a misunderstanding or a disagreement, those are not the most beneficial tactics to take. And seeking to understand, we have to stop and really try to see things from the other person's perspective and not throw in our bias or anything of that sort. And one of those things that he says in his book is diagnose before you prescribe. And it's all based off of a story, a personal experience he had when one of his daughters was very young. They were trying to get a hold of an on-call doctor. It was not their normal primary care physician. That on-call doctor was at a sporting event, wasn't really listening to the whole thing, and just said, okay, yeah, here's a prescription. I'll send it to a pharmacy, and hung up. And Stephen, our covey, said to his wife, hey, did you tell him that our child is a baby? And she's like, no. He should know that, though, shouldn't? And he's like, well, he's not the primary care physician. Call back. And immediately when I was telling my husband the story, he's like, oh, he got upset, didn't he? I'm like, actually, the doctor didn't. He realized he made a very, very significant error as a physician. He did not fully listen and try to understand where his patient was coming from, and so gave an improper prescription. The prescription was not for an infant because he never checked the age, and was really grateful that the parents called back and that got fixed and everything was fine. But that's something that sometimes we do. We think we're listening, we think we're getting the information, but because we haven't stopped and really focused and tried to see it from their perspective, we may not be asking really effective questions. And he talks about how this happens sometimes with kids. We can 21 question people to death and never really learn what's going on. So how's it going? Fine. What's happening? Oh, nothing much. The basic 2-word responses that we can very frequently get when we try to communicate with others. And instead, if we're being an empathetic listener, we might approach someone instead with, hey, you look a little frustrated. What's going on? Or, you seem sadder than normal. Okay, maybe that's the worst way to handle it. Okay, not normal. Here, let me phrase that better. See, I'm not perfect. You look sad today. Is there something that happened that I could help with? those would be more empathetic questions than how's it going or how are you doing? We all revert to those things sometimes. But having this in your toolbox is just helpful. And practicing those things are important. And you're gonna hear book and baby, and I'm sorry for that, but I want to make sure I'm presenting the information properly. This all takes practice. This all takes skills. This isn't something you learn overnight and become perfect at. These are things I've been learning my entire life, and I still have to practice them. And I still have to make it a active thing that I'm doing. And when this whole situation came down in the community, I initially sought out to correct the misunderstanding and all of that on social media, which was absolutely not the best thing to do, in my opinion. And part of it goes back to what he says in his book. He talks about maturity is the balance between courage and consideration. And consideration is the first half, the seeking to understand. Courage is the seeking to be understood. But then he goes into the seeking to be understood largely falls within our circle of concern. And media, when we start getting involved in social media with people who don't know us and don't really care who we are and what we think, don't have those interpersonal relationships, that's outside of our circle of concern, and we're just not going to be as successful. It is going to be a lot harder to get them to take us seriously and to get respect and work through the situation. And the other problem is, quite frequently, the people on the social media are not the ones in which the problem actually is occurring. And so it's important to pause and actually go and approach one-on-one the individuals in which we are having these misunderstandings with. So I was talking to my kids about disagreeing appropriately. And I made the mistake of trying to disagree online. Disagreeing online is not going to be productive. Having these interpersonal relationships and approaching the people directly, that's going to make the biggest impact. And so you have to stop and think about, okay, sorry, clearing my throat. But in my circle of concern and in my circle of influence, am I actually going to be able to reach this person in a way that is meaningful? And there are times where conflict will arise and the individual in which the conflict concerns, concerning that individual, yeah, that's how I meant to phrase it, it's not going to be effective to approach them right away, or maybe ever. They may not be ready or willing to listen. Now, my mom always would tell us, nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And that is a huge reason why trying to fight these battles out on social media is completely ineffective. They don't know that you care about them. They don't know that you have their best interest at heart. They don't know you. And they don't care what you have to say. So it's just not worth it. However, the people that we have direct relationships with, when we truly seek to understand them, that's one of the ways we can show them that we care. And then, hopefully, that will allow them to be more willing to listen to what we have to say and what we know or feel in regards to the situation. It's so easy to get stuck in one or two of those modes. The, I'm going to make everyone understand me, or the, I'm just going to be such a good listener and that'll fix the problem. One extreme or the other isn't going to fix the problem. You need to use both principles appropriately. If we just always seek to understand but never stand up for ourselves, we're going to end up doormats and feel frustrated and unheard, and it's not going to resolve the problem. On the other hand, If all we do is blast out our problem for the whole world and throw a fit or just get angry or, you know, anyway, just try to express ourselves without stopping to understand how the situation is impacting those around us, then we're not being courageous. We can oftentimes drift into being bullies ourselves. And I'm not saying that's always the case, but it can happen. And so either extreme isn't healthy. We've got to find a balance of both skills that bring us somewhere in the middle. And that's really the important part of all of this. The last thing I want to kind of talk about is the agree to disagree or disagreeing appropriately. So there's another individual, her name is Nicole Peck. I hope I'm saying her name right. Anyway, she teaches principles about parenting and interpersonal relationships. She's fabulous. I've been reading and looking into her stuff for years. One of the principles she teaches is disagreeing appropriately and accepting no answers. There are times where the answer is just going to be no. That's just life. And sometimes we have to accept that, walk away, and move on. It's not easy, but that's sometimes just where it is. The other thing is, sometimes we can disagree appropriately with it's not a no answer. There's room for nuance. There's room for discussion. But when we have those situations and we are trying to disagree appropriately, we need to remember to stay calm, collected, and clear in our communication. That we are expressing ourselves in a way that is considerate of those whom we are talking to and not accusatory. And the next part of all of that is proportional responses, not blowing things up out of proportion. So I talked to my kids about this a little bit, and it would be, for example, you want to sit in a certain spot. My kids frequently have disagreements about who gets to sit where in the vehicle. And for example, if one wants to sit, they both want to sit in the same spot. Everyone wants to sit next to baby cuteness. Well, I mean, of course, she's adorable. They all love her. So there are frequently arguments about sitting next to baby cuteness. And if one individual gets there first and the other person says it's their turn, and they could, communicate about it, talk about it, maybe come up with a system on who gets what turns and taking turns and all of that. Or they could just, hit their sibling, which is a thing kids can do. Not saying this has happened, but I'm saying that's a kid response. Talking it out or saying, hey, it's my turn, I'd like a turn, communicating, that's a proportional response. Walking up and smacking someone because they're sitting where you want to sit, not proportional. And that's on a kid level. There's other ways of describing it, but that's one I think that most people can grasp. These are all things that sometimes we do better at, sometimes we do worse at. And like I said before, we all have bad days. And it's important to remember that maybe they're just having a bad day. Maybe they're just didn't communicate it in a way they wanted to. Maybe there's something I don't understand. Maybe I'm not seeing the whole picture. And when we can stop and use these skills, it helps so often defuse situations that could go awry and maybe even spiral out of control. So that's my hot take for the week. Social media is probably not the best place to air out grievances and probably not the best place to try to convince people you're right. It probably won't work. Again, my hot take. Don't have to agree with it. That's my hot take. So, with all that said, I am your host, Sam Wolf. Like I said, lots of projects coming up, lots of things coming up. I kind of paused and talked about that all of this week because it was front and center in my life right now. And I felt like it was a worthwhile and timely thing to share, considering all of those facts. I hope you are all having a wonderful week. And maybe this week we can all work on having a little bit more grace and compassion for those around us. I'm going to work on that. I am your host, Sam Wolf, and you've been listening to Life of a Military Wife.